Hello, my name is Virginia Luzón. I come from the University of Zaragoza in Spain, and today I'm going to be talking about two examples of women's survival narratives, Wild and Tracks. When considering films dealing with survival, examples like Deliverance, Jaws, Castaway, Into the Wild, Life of Pi, and The Revenant come readily to mind. Upon closer consideration of these titles, there is an element that becomes evident, and that is the lack of women playing the main roles. Indeed, a quick internet search for survival films reveals the intensely masculinist outlook of this type of film. Although it tends to overlap with various genres, the survival in the wilderness film is generally thought of as a subgenre of the action-adventure narrative, from which women leads have remained largely, though not entirely, absent. There may be several reasons for this. In cultural terms, femininity does not seem to be compatible with such concepts as mobility, adventure, mastery, and survival, and more generally, life in the wilderness. Indeed, in patriarchal Western societies, femininity has been linked to domesticity, while at the same time, Mother Nature has been socially constructed as a resource to be tamed and exploited, which has provided fertile ground for the representation of myriad narratives of mastering masculinity. In addition, adventure narratives have sometimes, via the war film or the safari film, to name but a few, foregrounded the motif of dominance, conquering, and imperialism, an endeavor that has been regularly reserved for white men. However, what happens when these narratives are led by women? In this paper, I will be considering the motives that drive certain women into the wild, together with the ways in which they adapt to the environment. This paper therefore proposes to address these issues by focusing on narratives that deal with the idea of adventure and/or survival from a female perspective. Though normally absent from the aforementioned lists of essential survival films, several titles are worth mentioning: Walkabout, The Ballad of Little Joe, Rabbit Proof Fence, Mix Cutoff, The Hunger Games, Tracks, Wild, Endless Night, and The Shallows are among them. It is in the last 10 years or so that the film industry has started to produce more and more survival narratives led by resourceful women. Nevertheless, as Neil reminds us, female leads, though a minority, have existed in adventure narratives since the 1930s at least. Indeed, as Taves asserts in his essential account of the genre, there is nothing in its narrative structure that precludes the existence of women leads, so the explanation for this absence needs to be found elsewhere. The aforementioned films exhibit traits of the classical adventure narrative while also borrowing elements from other generic contexts, the Western, science fiction, horror, and the road movie among them. All of them showcase various ways in which capable women engage with nature and its challenges. Largely speaking, these narratives present nature in ambivalent terms. While it is understood to pose numerous dangers for the women protagonists, from broken toenails to dehydration to rape and death, direct contact with nature is at the same time considered to be therapeutic, liberating, and necessary. In this particular context, Tracks and Wild stand out. And here you can see the posters for these two films. In these two survival narratives, there is a strong focus on the notion of the journey. Though the protagonists of both films resolve to go on a long solo trek for different reasons, both narratives focus heavily on such motifs as individuality, independence, movement, the freedom and beauty provided by the contemplation of open spaces, the desire to disconnect from one's previous social environment and reconnect with nature in order to achieve personal renewal. These are the very traits that characterize the yet again thoroughly masculinized road movie genre. As Brereton says in Hollywood Utopia, and I quote, "Sublime landscape is foregrounded in road movies in order to promote deep ecological expressions of oneness with nature. Only with nature is fully accepted and appreciated and the protagonists become part of nature can they finally meet their destiny." unquote. Despite the genre's masculinist tendencies, this is a deep ecological, even eco-feminist aspect of the road movie that is clearly present in both the films under analysis here. On the other hand, in the road movie, the journey, rather than the final destination, presents the central motif or narrative concern. Thus, if the road movie constitutes a type of narrative that focuses on personal growth resulting from embarking on a journey, then Wild and Tracks can be read as exemplars of the road movie, albeit with the Pacific Crest Trail in the United States and the Australian desert substituting for the road and walking becoming the preferred back-to-basics means of transportation. It was over 150 years ago that Henry David Thoreau wrote an important essay entitled Walking. Here, he exalted the therapeutic quality of this activity, for it allows human beings to meditate, self-reflect, and reconnect with their natural, uncultivated, and wild selves by getting into close contact with nature and leaving urban artificiality behind. Much the same idea has more recently been expressed by road movie theorist David Laderman, and I quote, "Road movie journeys generally involve some kind of cultural critique, an exploration beyond the social conventions associated with home, work, and the family," unquote. Yet, whereas Thoreau practiced safe rambling near Concord, Massachusetts, our two resolute women protagonists embark on much longer and dangerous treks, though with roughly similar purposes. To use the words of one of these walkers, they voluntarily choose to place themselves in the way of beauty so as to redefine their existence in their own terms. In his seminal study of the survival film, Thomas Sobchak claims that their narrative pattern derives from the medieval romance and typically focuses on an ordinary but brave protagonist that surmounts great obstacles in extraordinary circumstances in order to achieve a specific goal, which usually involves the restoration of the social order. The isolation to which characters are subjected highlights the dangers and therefore maximizes their efforts. Sobchak also foregrounds the fantastic opportunities that adventure narratives, which are usually located in faraway, exotic locales, have regularly provided in terms of visual representation of the natural environment, which is a further characteristic that the road movie shares with the adventure genre. Natural landscapes are important in both Wild and Tracks, no matter how harsh or hostile they may be. And here you can see some stills exemplifying this idea. However, unlike in other examples of the adventure genre, they are not represented here so as to convey the idea of mastery. As Yvonne Tasker says, and I quote, "Adventure space typically exists to be conquered or in some way mastered. The hero," notice here the choice of gender, "representing a commanding figure within a natural landscape," unquote, thus exerting control of space and moving freely from one location to the next. In Wild and Tracks, the landscape is not represented as a site to be conquered, but as a site to commune with, a sacred site even in the latter case. And here again you can see some examples, some stills exemplifying this idea. At some point, Robin in the Australian production Tracks explains, "The trip wasn't meant as an adventure in the sense of something being conquered." And in fact, the heroines are never entirely in control of their surroundings. The threat of dehydration, rape, or death is ever present. Instead, the landscape is more romantically represented as a site in which to submerge yourself in order to become liberated from your own demons, from social convention, from social prejudice, from the company of others, and start again in your own terms. As already explained, adventure narratives do not usually incorporate female protagonists. Author and adventurer Lois Price, writing for The Independent in the UK, has pointed out that although real-life female adventurers have always existed, their exploits have generally been silenced. This is because, even today, And I quote, "There is something discomforting about the image of a capable female. A wild, free woman is a dangerous concept," unquote. As Price laments, this implies that women's adventure narratives tend to perpetuate the idea that females need a potent reason to hit the trail. Unlike their intrepid male counterparts, women can't possibly be doing it out of curiosity, to test their abilities, or just for the heck of it. In other words, they need to explain themselves. Price also believes that this general lack of interest in the female of the adventurous species derives from the fact that, and I'm quoting her again, "the reality of life on the road is too primal for public consumption, is messy and crude, and occasionally hairy in both senses of the word, all of which are regarded as unfeminine and therefore unpalatable for mainstream cinema," unquote. Hence, the comparably higher popularity, especially among male spectators, of the hypersexualized action-based formula, the post-feminist action-adventure subgenre par excellence. Wilde and Trax, however, choose to emphasize their protagonists' messiness and flaws, thereby refusing to present them as objects for erotic contemplation. Thus, these films reference the contemporary New Woman's film, as theorized by Hilary Radner, by placing their tough, though imperfect, female protagonists at the center of their narrative universe. It is probably no coincidence that Reese Witherspoon, one of the most important stars in the post-feminist era, chose to produce and star in Wilde. Much like Cheryl Strayed, author of the book on which the film is based, Witherspoon was looking for ways to redefine herself as a performing artist so as to leave her legally blonde, girly baggage behind. She hoped to do so by playing against type a frequently unpleasant working-class nymphomaniac drug addict going through bereavement. The foregrounding of consumerism and female sexuality that often characterizes the contemporary woman's film is certainly taken to the extreme in this movie. And it is in fact Cheryl's untrammeled sexuality and addiction that make her reach rock bottom. In a moment of desperation when she realizes that she's pregnant, a book about the PCT in a shop inspires her to take the 3,000-mile trek and embark on a sort of pilgrimage in order to find atonement and become the woman her mother thought she was. Wilde therefore provides a good example of the mainstream female-led narratives that Price criticizes, as it is as a result of inner turmoil that Cheryl retreats to the wilderness and chooses to put herself in the way of beauty. The fantastic, sublime landscape of the PCT becomes the therapeutic antidote Cheryl's troubled psyche was in need of. She thus follows in the footsteps of the Romantics. It is thanks to her incursion into the wild that Cheryl is able to come to terms with her mother's death, thus achieving self-knowledge and, more importantly, self-control. By the end of the narrative, Cheryl has become a different person, and the spectator learns that some years later she became married and had 2 children. Therefore, Cheryl's adventure allows her to redefine herself, but in strictly conventional ways by adopting a bourgeois identity. This is in tune with Sobchak's observations regarding the socially conformist tendencies of the adventure narrative. In contrast, Robin, in Trax, considers herself a perennial nomad who can't be at home anywhere. This narrative, moreover, does not so clearly force its protagonist to provide a potent reason for embarking on a 2,000-mile trek across the Australian outback. Like Wilde, the film is based on a true story which went on to become a bestseller, and although there are occasional flashbacks that point to a possible source of childhood trauma in the protagonist's life, Trax does not elaborate on this issue as extensively as the more melodramatic Wilde does. Instead, when Robin explains why she wants to hit the trail, she says, "Why not?" At some point, she also explains, "I just want to be alone." She mentions her father, who trekked across the Kalahari in his youth, and according to her, was happiest then, as well as Australian explorer Ludwig Leichhardt, who disappear when trying to cross Australia on horseback, as her real sources of inspiration. In essence, then, the protagonist's reasons seem to emanate not so much from personal trauma, but from her pure desire to become an independent woman, free from the conventions that her society imposes on her. The book on which the film is based was published during the 1970s. That is to say, the time that most represents the second wave of the feminist movement. In this way, Tracks follows in the footsteps of the 1970s independent woman's film. Robin's refusal to accept National Geographic photographer Rick Smolan as a trekking companion, let alone as a romantic companion, together with the film's overt denunciation of sexism and racism, clearly point in this direction. That said, Robin still depends on a male Aboriginal elder's knowledge, and Rick dropping water cans along her way, as well as her camels and dog, to be able to realize her dream. In this paper, I have tried to briefly analyze two recent, refreshing examples of the adventure genre from a gender perspective. Despite their differences, these films display a common concern in individual female self-realization through close contact with nature. They thus hark back to the Romantics, who believed in the power of landscapes as a space of pilgrimage where clearer moral truths about human nature could be found. Both Cheryl and Robin find peace and comfort in their pilgrimage and isolation. The former overcomes trauma and rebuilds her life, but the latter's lot is uncertain. Her physical destination has been reached, but her emotional one has probably not. So we can conclude, as the film does, that camel trips do not begin and end, they merely change form. Finally, examples like Track and Wild help to lead the survival genre in exciting new directions. The success of these two trailblazing films among critics and at the box office indicates that this new territory deserves further exploration. Hopefully, it will be charted in the years to come as more and more female leads start walking on the wild side. Thank you very much.